Hello everybody, and welcome to this fifth video of Merfolk Joe's Guide to Modern Merfolk. This video will discuss all the non-creature spells in the main deck of Modern Merfolk, and the basic roles they play. I'll begin with the two central non-creature spells, Spreading Seas and Aether Vial. After that, I'll discuss a few of our strongest options for the remaining non-creature flex spots in the deck, Dismember, Echoing Truth, Vapor Snag, and Spell Pierce. As with my video on the deck's creatures, my remarks here are not meant to be comprehensive nor definitive. If you would like me to expand upon any point or have any questions, please leave a comment. I'd like to start this section on Spreading Seas with a brief discussion of its recent history in the modern format. A lowly common from the Zendikar set, Spreading Seas sat on price lists for years at well below $1, only appealing to die-hard Merfolk players. However, as a result of the recent Eldrazi epidemic in the modern format, Spreading Seas, as a very efficiently costed land hate that replaces itself by drawing a card, shot up in price to well over $2. For the brief period of time when Eldrazi decks got to play both Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin, Spreading Seas saw sideboard and even main deck play in nearly every archetype that had access to blue mana, in an effort to slow the Eldrazi decks down. Here's a screenshot from GP Detroit in March of this year, during the quote-unquote Eldrazi Spring. We see Adam Jansen on blue-white control, casting Spreading Seas on Ben Rubin's only land, Stomping Ground. Rubin ended up scooping just a few turns later after failing to draw any more green sources. Jansen had brought Spreading Seas to the tournament specifically to deal with the overwhelming number of Eldrazi decks, but the blue enchantment single-handedly won him games against other decks as well, as we see in this example. A month later, in April, Eye of Ugin was banned, and the Eldrazi menace receded somewhat from the format. As we can see from the price chart, Spreading Seas stock went down a little bit as a result. But the card has still retained a relatively high price point since the Eldrazi Spring, as more players have become aware of its efficiency and versatility. As mentioned in a couple times in my previous videos, Spreading Seas earns its spot in Modern Merfolk by virtue of its ability to turn one of our opponent's lands into an island, in order to turn Island Walk on, making our creatures unblockable in combination with Lord of Atlantis or Master of the Pearl Trident. While doing this, Spreading Seas also draws us a card, helping us keep our hands stocked with Merfolk. A very important secondary use for Spreading Seas is to disrupt the opponent's mana. High priority targets include man lands, non-blue dual lands, and any utility land central to the opponent's strategy. In this example here, I'm starting my second turn on the play. My opponent opened by paying 2 life for an untapped Stomping Ground to play a Wild Nacatl, currently a 2/2, because Stomping Grounds is a mountain. By using my second turn to target the opponent's Stomping Ground with Spreading Seas, I render his investment of 2 life in the Stomping Ground worthless. The land will now only produce blue mana for the rest of the game. By turning the land into an island, the Nacatl is now only a 1/1. With the opponent on the back foot, we should attack and offer to trade our Curse Catcher. Since the opponent's Nacatl has the potential to become as big as a 3/3, this is a trade the opponent will rarely accept, and they'll take the damage. If the opponent did decide to block and accept the trade, we'd be fine with that as well. Merfolk has a better long game than most Zoo decks, as our creatures scale up with each new lord, and Master of Waves can instantly multiply our board presence. Continuing this example, my opponent untaps to begin his second turn. He plays an untapped Temple Garden, losing 2 more life. He then attacks with Wild Nacatl, who's now at 2/2 again, and I go down to 18 life. In his second main phase, the opponent plays a Scavenging Ooze. Note that Spreading Seas reduces the Scavenging Ooze's efficiency by reducing the opponent's access to green mana for its ability. For my third turn, I'll untap, play a land, cast a second Curse Catcher, and the Lord of Atlantis. I can safely attack with the earlier Curse Catcher, now at 2/2, because the Lord of Atlantis in combination with the Spreading Seas has given it Island Walk, and thus it can't be blocked. For the first time in this game, we're seeing the primary function of Spreading Seas, to make all our creatures unblockable and win games quickly with large attacks. The opponent takes 2 damage, and I pass the turn back. He untaps and plays a basic forest. It looks like he may be having some mana problems, as he has not yet been able to re-establish access to red mana since I played the Spreading Seas on his Stomping Ground earlier in the game. Here, he taps the Temple Garden and casts Path to Exile targeting my Lord of Atlantis. Why would the opponent choose to play this on his main phase, rather than during the upkeep of my next turn? Conventional wisdom says the Path to Exile would be more effective on my next upkeep, because I wouldn't be able to make use of the mana that the tapped land that comes in that play would be able to provide. So do you see why the opponent would choose to do it now, rather than during my upkeep? Well, the answer is the 2 Curse Catchers I have on my side of the board. My opponent almost certainly has another creature in hand he'd like to commit to the board this turn. However, if he plays the creature first, he would only be left with 1 mana for Path to Exile, and I could easily counter it by sacrificing one of my Curse Catchers. By casting the Path to Exile now, the opponent is prepared to pay for any taxes my Curse Catchers might put on his removal spell. As a consequence, I have to let the Path to Exile resolve. I do, however, get a tapped basic island out of my deck as part of the deal. The opponent turns his creature sideways, and I take 4 damage. In his second main phase, he taps his 2 remaining lands to play a second Scavenging Ooze, then passes the turn back to me. I untap for my 4th turn. I don't have a land to play, but my opponent generously donated one to me last turn while exiling my Lord of Atlantis. As a result, I have enough mana to cast Master of Waves. Here, we see a tertiary but by no means unimportant reason for playing Spreading Seas. As an enchantment, it is a permanent that provides blue devotion for Master of Waves. In this instance, Master of Waves will make 4 elemental tokens, bringing a total of 10 power to the battlefield, including himself. Without profitable attacks this turn, I'll pass back to the opponent. He untaps for his 4th turn, plays a Wooded Foothills, and cracks it to fetch an untapped Sacred Foundry, going down to 10 life in the process. My opponent then casts a Knight of the Reliquary and a second Wild Nacatl. Both Nacatls are now 3/3s, with the opponent controlling both a mountain and a plains. The Knight of the Reliquary is also a 3/3, with the Wooded Foothills in the graveyard. The Knight is a potential threat because of its ability to sacrifice the Stomping Ground, destroying our Spreading Seas in the process, and removing our access to Island Walk. For my 5th turn, I untap and draw. After playing a Mutavault, I cast Kira Great Glass Spinner. My Curse Catchers have been doing great work so far this game by reducing my opponent's ability to interact with my creatures, and Kira here takes that protection to another level. Any first removal spell on any of my creatures will be countered by Kira now, and any follow-up removal spells can get countered by the Curse Catchers. Next, I tap my 2 remaining lands and play Master of the Pearl Trident. Now that Island Walk is reestablished, I can swing with my Merfolk and deal 7 damage to the opponent, and I'll pass the turn back to him. After untapping and drawing, the opponent concedes. His army is outnumbered. Even if Knight of the Reliquary sacrifices the Stomping Ground to take me back off Island Walk, I can still simply Alpha Strike for the win, with my creatures all protected by Kira. In this game, we saw all 3 uses of Spreading Seas. 1. Provide access to Island Walk, while also drawing cards to allow us to keep applying pressure. 2. Disrupt the opponent's mana. And 3. Provide additional blue devotion for Master of Waves. As a 2-drop, in a deck full of 2-drops, it can often be tricky figuring out when to play Spreading Seas. Correct sequencing should be determined by our opponent's plays in the first couple of turns. If they've opened with a non-blue dual land, such as a Temple Garden or Blood Crypt, into something like a turn 2 Tectonic Edge, it can indicate that they're pinched on colored mana. In such a case, it's generally correct to lead with a Spreading Seas rather than a creature on turn 2, because of the potentially huge upside if the opponent is, in fact, short on lands. If opponent has mulliganed, I also believe it to be correct to lead on turn 2 with Spreading Seas, because of the increased likelihood of the opponent having land trouble due to having mulliganed. It's also generally correct to lead with Spreading Seas on turn 2 after playing a turn 1 Aether Vial, because we'll be able to deploy our 2-cost creatures with Aether Vial the following turn. And the card drawn off Spreading Seas will help us develop a more accurate and effective plan going forward. If the opponent only plays blue lands in his first 2 turns, it's going to be correct to lead with a 2-drop creature instead of Spreading Seas. Spreading Seas is suboptimal in these situations, since our opponent has already given us access to Island Walk, and we're less likely to disrupt their mana. Though not even a creature, there's perhaps no card more symbolic of the Merfolk archetype than Aether Vial. Included as a full playset in virtually every Merfolk deck in both Legacy and Modern, Aether Vial helps the deck have its most explosive starts. The 1-cost artifact not only helps get more Merfolk into play in the early turns of the game, it does so at instant speed. This puts the opponent on the back foot, as any of our creatures can upset their plans at any given moment. Curse Catcher can counter a spell. Silvergill can draw us a card. Harbinger can bounce an opposing creature. Any Lord can make all our creatures bigger. Kira can protect our Merfolk. And Master of Waves can bring an entire army to the battlefield, all at instant speed. I don't know of another single Magic card that can have such a large impact on the battlefield over multiple turns for the low upfront cost of 1 generic mana. Aether Vial is a card that makes all our creatures better and contributes to making Merfolk a strong tempo deck, upsetting the opponent's plans while furthering our own. To understand exactly how much positive tempo a turn 1 Aether Vial can provide, let's take a quick look at the first 4 turns of 2 decks, one without the powerful artifact and one with. Without Aether Vial, a creature deck can play a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, a 3-drop on turn 3, and a 4-drop on turn 4. That's assuming the player makes all his or her land drops, casting creature spells with perfect mana efficiency across the first 4 turns. We can see this results in 4 creatures on the board, with the sum of their mana cost equaling 10. With Aether Vial, a deck loses a bit of tempo on turn 1, playing the artifact with their earliest mana. However, this investment pays off quickly on turn 2, when the pilot can cast a 2-drop, and use Aether Vial to put a 1-drop creature onto the battlefield. We can see that, at the end of their respective second turns, each deck has 3 mana's worth of creatures on the board. Turn 3, however, is where that parity is broken. The Aether Vial deck can now cast a 3-drop creature and use Aether Vial to put a 2-drop creature onto the battlefield. The same double curve effect continues in turn 4, casting a 4-drop and using Aether Vial for a 3-drop. As with the non-Aether Vial deck, we assume this player makes all his or her land drops and plays creature spells with perfect mana efficiency across the first 4 turns. We can see this results in 6 creatures on the board, with the sum of their mana cost equaling 15. In both total creatures and total mana deployment, the Aether Vial deck has access to 50% more efficient tempo across the first 4 turns of the game, an absolutely huge margin in a game of tight margins. So Aether Vial is obviously a very powerful Magic card. However, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. And as Merfolk players, it's your responsibility to make the best use of Aether Vial possible. In order to help you do so, I'll explain some guidelines for how to correctly use the card. My first point is the most fundamental. As a general rule, we should be looking to activate Aether Vial on our opponent's turn, rather than our own. This is for 2 related reasons. First, waiting until the opponent's turn to activate Aether Vial hides information from our opponent, and thus makes it more difficult for them to play optimally. Second, waiting until the opponent's turn to activate Aether Vial gives us more information about the opponent's plan, and thus makes it easier for us to play optimally. Let's look at a couple of examples to see these reasons in action. I'll start with a very common case against a Grixis opponent. It's our 3rd turn, and the opponent has 1 red and 1 black mana up, representing Lightning Bolt or Terminate. We attack with our Silvergill Adept, and the opponent declares no blocks and asks if we have any effects before damage. Many Merfolk players would mistakenly activate Aether Vial now to bring in an Island Walk Lord to squeeze in 1 extra point of damage. However, our opponent can then simply kill the Lord, a far more important creature than the Silvergill, while making perfectly efficient use of his mana and spells. Let's rewind. If instead we simply pass priority to the damage step, the opponent is faced with the dilemma of whether to spend his removal on the Silvergill to prevent the 2 damage and kill a relatively unimportant creature now, or save his removal for later, when more valuable creatures are sure to show up. In either scenario, we come out ahead. If he kills the Silvergill now, that's 1 less removal spell that can target our lords later in the game. If he doesn't kill the Silvergill now, he takes 2 damage and we move on with the game. Having committed to saving his removal for a Lord, the opponent has fallen way behind on board and has lost a great deal of tempo by not using his mana efficiently. With Aether Vial still untapped, we can activate it at our discretion on the opponent's turn. Against an untapped Aether Vial, the opponent still faces a dilemma on their turn. Should they leave up mana for removal again this turn, or be proactive and develop their board? Against our relatively full board, even the most marginally proactive of strategies would typically choose to develop their board in this spot. This is where Merfolk can punish decks. Activating Aether Vial in the opponent's end step, with them tapped out, we have free reign to untap, develop our board, and attack, often with Island Walk. Now let's look at a situation against a blue-white control deck. We're late in the game, with both of us at 6 life with no cards in hand. The opponent just put Celestial Colonnade into play tapped, and passed the turn. We're lucky enough to draw a Master of Waves with an Aether Vial already on 4 counters. There would be no justification for activating Aether Vial right now. Master of Waves and his elemental tokens don't have haste, and can't attack until our next turn. They would just sit on the battlefield, and the opponent would have perfect information during their next turn. Let's say we do activate the Aether Vial on our own turn. For the opponent's turn, he draws Cryptic Command. Now, knowing that their life total is threatened by the Master of Waves, the opponent can just pass the turn back to us, tap our creatures and draw a card with Cryptic Command, giving them time and resources to potentially close out the game. By activating Aether Vial too soon, we have put the opponent in the driver's seat. Now let's rewind and analyze what the opponent might think if we had just immediately passed the turn back upon drawing Master of Waves. When they drew the Cryptic Command, they'd likely look at our board and see 0 threats. Yes, there's a possibility we drew the Master of Waves, but what are the chances? In fact, the opponent remembers that he exiled one earlier in the game with Path to Exile, and another died to a Supreme Verdict, so there are only 2 Masters of Waves left in the entire deck, at most. Meanwhile, the opponent's Celestial Colonnade represents a 2-turn clock. The shields are down, so why not go for it? The opponent taps 5 of his lands, activates the Celestial Colonnade, and attacks for 4, taking us down to 2 life. On their end step, of course, we would activate Aether Vial, bring in Master of Waves, making 2 elemental tokens for a total of 6 power. Without access to enough mana to cast their Cryptic Command, we can now safely attack for the win on our turn. Hopefully these 2 examples make it clear why we should, in general, look to activate Aether Vial on the opponent's turn. There are many situations where it will be correct to activate Vial on our own turn, but as a default, waiting until the opponent's turn gives us access to more information while hiding information from the opponent. My second point will discuss the merfolk whose deployment with Aether Vial is the least complex, Silvergill Adept. Silvergill Adept is very strong with Aether Vial. We get a 2/1 merfolk and get to draw a card at instant speed for 0 mana. Now, Silvergill is the biggest exception to the first rule about waiting until the opponent's turn to activate Aether Vial. Because he draws us a card, and seeing more cards gives us a better chance to devise an optimal strategy and ultimately win games, it's often best with a Silvergill in hand to activate Aether Vial as our very first action in our pre-combat main phase. It's generally correct to use Aether Vial rather than casting the Silvergill Adept, because we may draw into spells, such as Spreading Seas or Dismember, that we would want to use our mana for. However, an exception to this is when we only have 1 blue source available, in which case casting Silvergill is likely the most effective use of that mana, and Aether Vial can be used to deploy a double blue 2-drop from our hand. People frequently make the mistake of playing their land for the turn before playing Silvergill. In general, it's much better to play Silvergill first with Aether Vial, and then make the land drop afterwards. Some cards that could influence what our land drop should be include Blood Moon, Choke, Goblin Piledriver, and Etched Champion. By playing Silvergill Adept first, we can make a fully educated decision about our land drop for the turn. One situation to look out for involves having a Silvergill Adept in hand during our upkeep, with Aether Vial on 2 counters and its trigger still on the stack. If our lands and cards in hand make it unclear whether it would be best to tick Aether Vial up or leave it on 2 counters, we can activate the Vial during our upkeep to bring Silvergill into play and draw a card. This card could inform our decision on how best to resolve the Aether Vial trigger this turn. If we draw a land off of Silvergill, we'll likely want to leave the Aether Vial on 2 counters, since there are so many 2-drop creatures in the deck, and we'll be sure to draw into some in subsequent turns. However, if we don't hit that land off of Silvergill, we'll likely want to keep the However, if we don't hit that 4th land off Aether Vial, we can tick it up to 3 this turn, allowing us to go directly to 4 next turn and get that Master of Waves on board sooner. So in general, using Silvergill Adept with Aether Vial is very straightforward. It should typically be the first thing you do in a turn in order to get that extra card in your hand. It's always better to have more information before making our plays. My third point will discuss the merfolk whose deployment with Aether Vial is the most complex, Cursecatcher. This little guy's ability, in combination with Aether Vial, can work as an effective counterspell. Many times, the situation will be obvious. The opponent taps out to cast a removal spell, and we activate Aether Vial in response, bringing in Cursecatcher and sacrificing him to counter the removal spell, protecting our larger creature. However, the timing on activating an Aether Vial with 1 counter can be tricky. A savvy opponent will be aware that an Aether Vial with 1 counter on it represents Cursecatcher. Such an opponent can wait for us to activate the Vial on their end step in our typical manner. Then, with Aether Vial's ability on the stack, the opponent can safely cast and resolve a removal spell, since Curse Catcher has not yet reached the battlefield. Once he does arrive, the Lord of Atlantis will be dead. Jund is one of the trickiest decks against which to correctly use Curse Catcher with Aether Vial. To understand why, let's look at this example, which begins on the Jund player's third turn. They simply play a land and pass the turn back to us. Now, Instinct would have us activate Aether Vial in their end step, so that we'll have our creature available to attack next turn. But this all too often leads to one of the largest possible early game blowouts against Merfolk. Kolaghan's Command, destroying Aether Vial and our 2-drop. By the time Curse Catcher arrives, our battlefield has been scorched. Since this line is so backbreaking, it's correct to not activate Aether Vial in this situation. Instead, we should untap and go to our next upkeep. And the opponent will most often read our lack of end-step activation as a sign that we don't have the Curse Catcher. Thinking the shields are down, they'll play their Kolaghan's Command during our upkeep with the Aether Vial trigger on the stack, attempting to prevent us from ticking it up to 2 counters. However, they've been outplayed, and we can now tap our Aether Vial to bring Curse Catcher in, turning the tables and blowing them out by countering their valuable 3-drop spell with our lowly 1-drop. And then we can safely tick up to 2 counters. If the opponent doesn't have the Kolaghan's Command in this situation, then all we've missed out on by waiting like this is the opportunity to bring Curse Catcher in with Aether Vial. But this being our third turn, we should be able to simply cast the Curse Catcher along with a 2-drop this turn. Now, it's very important to point out that with some smart play, it's possible to totally avoid this dangerous situation. Let's rewind to just before that example, to the beginning of our second turn. If the opponent is tapped out at this point, the heads-up play is to activate Aether Vial on our own turn right now to establish Curse Catcher's onboard counterspell effect before the opponent even has an opportunity to put down a third land and threaten Kolaghan's Command next turn. Okay, so let's back up again. If the Jund opponent has one untapped red source during our second turn, this represents Lightning Bolt. If your only 2-drops in hand are creatures, don't let Lightning Bolt deter you. The opponent is bound to have some removal throughout the game, as removal spells make up a large percentage of Jund's cards. Go ahead and play out that 2-drop. However, if the opponent does cast Lightning Bolt, you should not use Aether Vial and sacrifice Curse Catcher to save your 2-drop here. Can you guess why? Yes, it's still because of the huge threat of a turn 3 Kolaghan's Command. and that threat with an Aether Vial on the board is too much to bring the Curse Catcher in at this point. If we do bring him in and to save the 2-drop, then the opponent has the green light to destroy our board with Kolaghan's Command on their next turn. Keeping Curse Catcher in hand and letting the Lightning Bolt resolve will most likely make the opponent think we don't have the Curse Catcher, which will make them much more likely to try to resolve Kolaghan's Command on their own third turn, since the opponent doesn't want to let us untap and potentially draw into counter magic. And of course, at this point we can activate Aether Vial and slam the Curse Catcher down. Keeping Curse Catcher in hand in response to the turn 2 Lightning Bolt is also a great play if the opponent has Liliana for their third turn instead of Kolaghan's Command, as she won't get to edict away any of our creatures, and we can start attacking her on the very next turn with Curse Catcher. So as you can see, Curse Catcher can be quite challenging to use optimally with Aether Vial, and Jund with Kolaghan's Command is just a single example of a board state that is typically much more complex than meets the eye. Just try to always be thoughtful of what your opponent could have, and then act accordingly. You are going to get blown out from time to time, it's part of the game, but the flexibility of timing that Aether Vial affords us in combination with Curse Catcher's powerful ability can often be very rewarding, catching opponents off guard and swinging games in our direction. My last point will discuss a little trick that allows us to skip from 2 counters on Aether Vial all the way up to 4 counters. This comes up surprisingly often and is incredibly important for every modern Merfolk pilot to understand. On our upkeep, if Aether Vial has 2 counters on it, we can tap it and activate its ability in response to its own upkeep trigger to put a 2-drop creature onto the battlefield, and then let the upkeep trigger resolve, ticking the Aether Vial up to 3 counters. Thus, on our very next upkeep, we'll be able to tick the Vial up to 4 counters, and be ready to deploy a Master of Waves right away. This line of play is so important because we run so many 2-drops. We want to get Master of Waves, our most powerful creature, onto the battlefield as soon as possible, but we also want to deploy as many of our 2-drop creatures at the same time. This little trick allows us to use the turn when Aether Vial would normally be on 3 counters to deploy a 2-drop, while still getting us up to 4 counters as quickly as possible. With Spreading Seas and Ethereal out of the way, I'd like to touch briefly now on the non-creature spells that round out the few remaining flex spots in Modern Merfolk. One of the only drawbacks of playing a mono-blue deck is that blue doesn't have access to unconditional creature removal in its portion of the color pie, and we often require this kind of removal. This is where Dismember comes in. Costing 1 generic mana and 2 black Phyrexian mana, Modern Merfolk always pays 1 mana and 4 life to cast this spell, unless an opponent happens to have an Urborg in play, in which case we can choose to play with black mana instead of life. So always look out for Urborg. While paying 4 life is a real cost and makes Dismember unplayable at points in the game where we have 4 or less life, it is a very reasonable cost for the ability to permanently remove creatures essential to our opponent's plan. Using Harbinger of the Tides, Vapor Snag, or Echoing Truth to bounce creatures with powerful enters the battlefield triggers, such as Siege Rhino, Vendilion Click, and Snapcaster Mage, is always going to be suboptimal because we don't want our opponent to recast them. In these cases, Dismember can just kill them dead. Modern is a format dominated by creatures. While Harbinger can deal with some opposing creatures, and Island Walk can often simply render those creatures harmless, there's always going to be instances where we simply need to remove an opposing threat. Dismember is far and away our best choice for this. At 2 copies in my deck, I rarely draw both, but can usually manage the life loss if I happen to do so. At 3 or 4 copies, which I've tested, I feel I draw too many copies too often, because again, the life loss is a real cost that must be managed. Last but not least is my Singleton Echoing Truth. This card has won me so many games that I would have otherwise lost. The ability to bounce any non-land permanent, and in multiples, is extremely powerful. Modern decks play a wide array of troublesome non-land permanents, such as Ensnaring Bridge, Ghostly Prison, and Planeswalkers, in addition to creatures and creature tokens. In the case of Ensnaring Bridge and Ghostly Prison, there's often literally no way for Merfolk decks to win once they resolve. However, decks that play these kinds of permanents often play a very slow game, stopping our attack step to allow them to draw more cards, control the game, and eventually win. This extra time gives us many draw steps as well, and a good chance at drawing the Singleton Echoing Truth later in the game. Against creatures, Echoing Truth has to be compared with Vapor Snag. Vapor Snag has the advantages of being cheaper, making the opponent lose 1 life, and being able to hit man lands. Its drawbacks, however, are severe. It can only target creatures, and it can only ever bounce 1 creature. Echoing Truth, on the other hand, for only 1 extra generic mana, can still bounce any creature with the potential upside of hitting multiples for huge value. Echoing Truth is often a 2 mana instant speed one-sided Wrath of God against token decks. On top of this utility, it can bounce any troublesome enchantment, artifact, or planeswalker. Or if an opponent casts a spell like Supreme Verdict, we can bounce multiples of our creatures back to our hand. This immense versatility for me makes Echoing Truth a very easy pick for the deck over Vapor Snag, especially since the addition of Harbinger of the Tides to the deck has given us access to more creature bounce effects, making a spell like Vapor Snag far less necessary to play in the main deck. Finally, I want to take a moment to explain why I think Spell Pierce is a bad choice for Modern Merfolk. As I mentioned a moment ago, while discussing Dismember, Modern is a format dominated by creatures. Even decks that run many non-creature spells, such as Jund and Grixis, still run plenty of powerful creatures. For this reason, it's generally impossible to predict whether an opponent will be casting a creature or non-creature spell during their early turns. Spell Pierce invites us to leave up mana in the early game in the hopes of catching the opponent casting a non-creature spell. However, some large percentage of the time, they'll cast a creature instead, and we'll have wasted our mana and lost tempo. So it's clear that Spell Pierce has severe shortcomings in the early game. Unfortunately, it only grows worse as the game goes on, and the opponent makes more and more land drops. Eventually, Spell Pierce becomes a nearly worthless card, as the opponent will often have 2 extra mana available. And of course, many decks will simply continue casting creatures all game, and Spell Pierce will be useless for that reason. Modern Merfolk already runs some cards that are only particularly powerful in certain situations. Cursecatcher loses some of its punch against decks without many instants or sorceries. However, it's still our best choice for a 1-drop Merfolk. Harbinger of the Tides is mediocre against decks without many creatures. However, as I've mentioned several times now, in Modern, most decks do play many creatures, and so Harbinger gets to shine more often than not. And Spreading Seas is not very amazing against other blue decks, but at least it replaces itself by drawing a card. Spell Pierce does not have any of these redeeming qualities. In my view, it's far too situational in the Modern format to include in the main deck, and we have better options for counterspells in the sideboard. This concludes the 5th video, where we've looked at the deck's non-creature spells. Please join me for the next video, which will focus on all the different lands played in Modern Merfolk. As always, please leave any comments or questions you might have, and please subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Thank you.